Hello and welcome to our training on accessibility, the what and the why. In our training today, we're going to cover what accessibility means and kind of lay down the foundation for understanding how it affects students as well as the federal laws that support it. To get started, I'd like to introduce myself. So my name is Danae Cowell and I'm the Online Accessibility Professional here at the Graduate School and Stout Online. My email is cowlld@uwstout.edu and is listed out for you in case you'd like to contact me during the training or afterwards with any questions or comments you might have. So to define accessibility, accessibility refers to the design of products, devices, services, or environments that is inclusive for people with disabilities. It gets at both direct access, so unassisted access, and indirect access, so using a tool or technology to obtain access. Really simplified, I like to think about accessibility as providing equal access for all. Okay, so when we think about the online environment though, what does accessibility mean there? Well, it means that people are able to obtain and navigate through information that's available on the web. It also means that we have designed web pages and web content to be compatible with assistive technologies like screen readers and screen magnifiers. Not only that, but it means that we're helping to eliminate the digital divide. And I'm not just talking about creating access for people that don't have internet or computers, but I'm talking about people that have access to internet and computers, but who might have had a disability that barred them from really interacting with the web if it wasn't designed appropriately. So really widening the audience which can use web content. So this next slide is really looking at the difference between accessibility and accommodation. Now, a lot of times people come to these trainings or they start talking to me about accessibility and they're not exactly sure how it is different. So accommodations have been around a very long time and are a process in which students identify as having disabilities and then seek out services for those disabilities. And the university's response is to provide an individual design or individual plan to help meet that specific student need. So they'll provide very specific accommodations. And this is more of a reactive approach that's used when it's really hard to anticipate student needs. Now, on the flip side, there's accessibility. And accessibility is a proactive approach to design. And it is design that considers all abilities of our students and our learners. And it's provided without students having to identify or seek out services. So both of these are very important concepts and both of them help to ensure student success for our students with disabilities. However, they are different. One thing to keep in mind though is that both are required under federal law in the US. Okay, so moving on, I put 3 key areas that you'll want to think about when you're designing online courses. So these are 3 areas that you would approach differently depending on what you're working with. So first would be web accessibility. So this would mean the web design and web development of our courses. So Canvas or D2L would need to be accessible in and of themselves, as well as anything that instructors may put into those LMSs. So if you're creating a news posting or an announcement or adding a discussion prompt, anything within that rich content editor. The second area would be your course content, so the files that you're putting within your course. So for example, any Word documents, any video files, any PowerPoints, things of that nature would be considered your course content. Lastly, an area to consider would be your tool accessibility. So the tools that you use in your course to help facilitate learning. One example might be Google Docs. So using Google Docs to have students collaborate on a project. Well, when using that, we would want to consider the Google Docs accessibility and if it's helping to meet our student needs. So while I did not mention physical spaces here, I would say this would also be a consideration for anyone who teaches on campus or is part of an on-campus department. It would be important to think about our classrooms, the physical materials we have, our signage, our buildings, the walkways, any place we would ask students to go on field trips or for learning experiences. Those would all need to be thought about as well. Okay, so moving on to who benefits. So accessibility is designed for those with disabilities, and it does help to benefit those that have vision loss, color blindness, who are completely blind, those that might be deaf or hard of hearing, those with mobility issues, those that have learning disabilities, as well as people who have age-related impairments or those that experience seizures as examples. However, it's important to consider that accessibility also benefits people without disabilities. So it really is helpful for everyone. So it can benefit people who are in noisy or distracting locations, people who have low literacy skills or who are language learners, people who are working with really complex or challenging terminology, people who are using smaller screens and devices. So think of your tablets, your cell phones, things of that nature, as well as people who are new to technology and are not maybe tech savvy. You might be asking yourself, why is accessibility important? Well, it's important because it does support equality. It's helping to open up opportunities and environments to a greater number of people. Not only that, but it is the morally right thing to do, and it is supported by international web standards, and within the US, it is required by federal law. So, some important legislation in the US. So, as I mentioned, within the United States, we do mandate accessibility. So, what is supporting accessibility? Well, first, there is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then there is also the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, in particular, Section 504 and Section 508. And we're going to dive into these acts moving forward. So, first off is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this act was established in 1990 and it is prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities, and it focuses on five key areas, and that includes employment, transportation, public accommodation, communications, and governmental activities. And it also applies to employment agencies and labor organizations as well. Now, the other act that is pretty particularly important is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or the Rehab Act, that is prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disabilities in programs run by federal agencies that receive federal financial assistance in federal employment and in the employment practices of federal contractors. And again, as I mentioned, it has many sections, but those that are most important to us are going to be Section 504 as well as Section 508. So, Section 504. Section 504 was designed to protect the rights of people with disabilities and ensure that are able to participate in programs that receive federal financial assistance from the United States Department of Education. So, essentially referring to schools and places of higher learning. And a lot of times, this piece is what influences that accommodation process and ensures that we provide accommodations for students. Next is Section 508, and Section 508 is what requires all electronic and informational technology to be developed, procured, maintained, or used by the federal government be accessible to people with disabilities. So, this is really the section that outlines the standards for web accessibility. And I do want to note that in January 2018, so very recently, Section 508 was refreshed, so it was updated to align with the international standards that exist. So talking a little bit more about these international web standards, they are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. So these are the international standards that were created by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. And they are created and based upon these four really key principles of accessibility. So the first one is that web information should be perceivable. This means that users are able to perceive the information using their senses. So really think of how people are interacting with web content. The second one is that web information needs to be operable. So user interface components and navigation needs to be easy for people to do, and everything has to be able to be operable. This means that no interface component or action cannot be performed by a user. Next is that web information needs to be understandable. So information that's presented as well as the user interface needs to be easy to understand by the user. Lastly is the idea of web information and web pages being robust in nature. And this is really saying that it has to work with a variety of different technologies. So web pages need to work with tablets, cell phones, computers, assistive technologies. They need to work with all of these different things, and they also need to be keeping up to date with technological changes and advances. So that kind of summarizes the four key principles. So moving on, the WCAG, or like we've talked about, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, are grouped into three different levels. And so the first level is the basic level, and this is level A, and you're only meeting the bare minimum guidelines. Then level AA is the intermediate level of conformance. So you're meeting all of the level A standards, and then you're adding some additional ones on top of that. And then level AAA is a very advanced level of conformance, and this would really be aspiring to best practices out there. So Section 508 does now mandate level AA compliance to these guidelines. So it's important to keep that in mind, that we shouldn't just be meeting the basic level, but we really should be at that intermediate level of conformance at this point with our websites and web content. Okay, so obviously I've talked a lot about the relevant laws within the US, and I wanted to bring about what has been happening because of these laws. So what we found in our research was that in 2017, 814 lawsuits were filed due to inaccessible web content. So quite a large number. And keep in mind, over the years, a variety of different universities and colleges have been involved in complaints. So I have listed out some of them for you. This list is not complete. There's more out there that have had a complaint filed. However, if you look at this list, it's easy to see some big name universities on here. So you can see there's Harvard, Princeton University, Penn State, MIT, some really big universities, as well as some that have a very big online presence. So Capella or Arizona State University, as well as some smaller colleges too are on here. So the Atlantic Cape Cod Community College or the California Community Colleges are on here as well. And really the point of this is saying that any university, if they have inaccessible content or web pages, could be the next lawsuit. So it's important for us to start thinking about this now. Okay, so continuing on. Accessibility moving forward. So yes, I have talked a lot about the federal guidelines that are out there, the federal laws that exist, and really hoping to get us on a path where we can start to be compliant. However, in the future, we would really like to work towards commitment. So having a commitment to accessibility and accessible environments for our students that naturally turns into an inclusive culture where we design courses and experiences that are student-centered and consider student needs first. So kind of the overview of where we would like to go. But obviously compliance, meeting those federal laws is the first place. It's our starting point. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, we would be happy to answer them. You're welcome to email me. Again, my email is cowld@uwstout.edu. And here are the references that we used when composing this presentation for you. So thank you for joining us.